And just like that, this week, Mississippi's Congress pulled it down and said they're going to have a vote on the next flag in November. They fought so hard to keep the history of our heritage hanging up high at this, all over the state, and then all of a sudden, we don't have to have this anymore.
Yeah.
And that's in Mississippi, you know. And I mean, and while this is not a government thing like a statue or anything, but I also think about what happened with fucking Aunt Jemima.
Yeah.
Like, something that has been known and openly acknowledged as this is racist as fuck. And suddenly, all right, we're going to remove it. Like, the hope is, of course, appeasement. And so much stuff is appeasement. But as good as it is to see all these statues and symbols of oppression and symbols of hate and racism and white supremacy, as great as it is to see them fall, it's important to remember that these are just symbols. The problem is still there.
Yeah.
And like the protests and stuff have been they're asking for an end to systemic racism, to an end to the murder of innocent people, innocent Black people especially.
Yeah.
And throwing down statues or taking a racist caricature off of a syrup bottle ain't what we asking for.
Exactly.
Like, don't get it twisted. Like, that ain't it. You didn't make some grand change.
Yeah, on a related note, one of my Facebook friends this week, you may have seen this, Keem, made a post about infighting between activist groups, saying that some of the people want to sit down with city leaders and hash things out, and some of the people are out there yelling and want to tear everything down, and those two groups are fighting each other, and tried to paint it as a bad thing that there was this huge difference of opinion between these two groups of like these two philosophies of how things are going to be done. And I made the comment basically that like the reason that the people who are insisting that we tear everything down are against the people who want to sit down with city leaders is because city leaders will they will tie themselves in knots to avoid giving us any real systemic change, because that would mean giving up their own power. And they want to hang on to that power at any cost. And so sitting down with city leaders in an attempt to make real, actual change is a process that's going to take for fucking ever to see even the smallest wins, because you have to first convince them to give up the things that they have.
Right.
In order to achieve real justice. And it's like, and somebody else posted that like the people who are out here demanding real change, the people who are out here demanding real change aren't even invited to that meeting because city leaders know that they're not going to put up with the bullshit and the pandering and the fucking appeasement.
Right. The goal is to get for city leaders and government leaders, it's tokenism.
Yes.
You get you sit down and you sit down and go, well, these people, since they're not out, rabble rousing, they're the leaders. They're the ones you should be following, and we're going to talk to them, and no one else is going to get a seat at the table because everybody else is just out of control, rioting, and we're going to demonize them and get only work with these people. But when they get those people in there, it's back to appeasement. Okay, exactly. We're going to give you this, and then you can go away.
Exactly.
And what people also don't realize is, for the people going in there to have these discussions, who are quote unquote hashing it out with city leaders or government leaders, where do you think the pressure is coming from? Where do you think the leverage is coming from for those people to be able to even have these discussions? Mm-hmm. It ain't from just people going, we're going to come work with you. It's from the people yelling and saying, tear shit down.
Yeah.
Because if they weren't out there doing anything, the government leaders would just be doing what they were doing before.
Yeah, I read a Twitter thread, because this is where all my information comes from. You probably, Keem, as a historian, you probably already know this, right? Where everyone keeps holding up Martin Luther King Jr. as like this ideal of like, this is how you should protest and this is how you should do this, and look at how much he achieved when he was peaceful. And nobody talks about the fact that Martin Luther King's nonviolent actions, first off, were carefully planned and had specific goals. He wasn't just out here marching, right? He had a strategy. And all of this nonviolence and even letting the police beat up people, that was all part of a specific strategy. But also...
I'd like to point out, specifically beat up young people.
Yes. That was a very specific strategy. But also, that was only effective because there was another branch of the movement that was not at all nonviolent. And the whole, like, a huge part of the strategy was King, like, basically intentionally standing in between the fucking white government and the militant armed black people with whom he was collaborating, telling the white people, you better work with me, otherwise these people.
Right. I mean, they were his bludgeon, like the deacons of defense.
Yes. Like this, and this is a strategy that never is talked about. I am 33 fucking years old, and I just learned about some of this. Like, I kind of sort of knew, like, in a roundabout half-assed way, like, that some of these groups existed, but it took this moment to understand that that's what was happening and that's what was going on, and how intentional that was, to where it made King look like this super reasonable one, and that was all on purpose, right? Like, all of this was intentionally planned to make people seem certain, like, in certain ways. And I think what's happening right now is there's a group of people who don't understand the significance of what King was doing, who are trying to model, quote unquote, model themselves after him and go work with city leaders. And then there's a group of people who may or may not understand that strategy, who are trying to force the change. And what we need is for everybody to understand what that strategy is and work together.
And see that, but that's because it's purposeful. Like,
oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah, like, of course, and we've talked about this a million times, but like, the reality of Dr. King has been very purposefully watered down and pitched a certain way to basically promote I forgot, what do you call it when basically promote people being prostrate.
Being what?
Prostrate, like
yeah.
And people, and since that's the narrative, since that's the lesson that they're taught in all the history classes and taught in all the schools and showed on TV, that's what people think that, well, Dr. King did it and he was so effective and that's the only way we can do things. Or they're given, well, Malcolm X was violent, so if we can't go that way, it's got to be the other way, when no one knows the actual how the strategies of both men, how they work together.
Yeah.
Because they did. And honestly, and I say this a lot, for the people who are just like, oh, well, we got to sit down and talk to people and be peaceful and this and that. You also have to look at the outcome of what happened to Dr. King.
Yeah.
And where we are now. Because we talk about effectiveness, yet we're still having the exact same problems.
Mm-hmm.
We're still in the streets marching and advocating for the exact same things. And how can you sit there and look at that and say, well, it's so successful. This is what we got to do. This is the only way things work. It doesn't. It didn't. Like let's be real. And you can look at the arc of history. You can look at the arc of history. Most big changes did not come without upheaval.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring this back around. I'm bringing this back around to talk about statues and protesters pulling them the fuck down. You know, I'm going to date this. Tomorrow's the 4th of July. Now, I'm not celebrating that shit. But for y'all, for those of you who don't know, revolutionary soldiers tore down statues of King George. And you know what they did with those statues? They melted them down and turned them into musket balls. That's how this country started.
Yup.
Like, let's all just be very real and very honest. You want to talk about patriotism? You want to talk about country and history? Know your fucking history. And I actually want to say something even about that and the statues of the founding fathers, because quote unquote founding fathers, because one of the big things was, well, don't tear down pictures of the founding fathers because they, did this and did that or blah, blah, blah. First of all, they acknowledged in their time that what they were doing was fucked up. They acknowledged that slavery was fucked up.
Yeah.
It was a stain on their legacy. They knew it. They knew it. They wouldn't have wanted statues of themselves up. They would have lost, they would have lost it. That's like, that wasn't even the ideals that that the founding fathers, like the founders of the country, quote unquote, would have stood for. They would not have wanted statues. So you sit up here and say, well, we got to keep these because of this and that, when you're not even holding up to the legacy of them, basically.
Yeah.
Like, people talk about defending history or whatever. No, you're trying to defend white supremacy. You're trying to defend your feeling of safety in the world, because these symbols are symbols of society